considerably east of here by about 50 miles or so, but it's absolutely gorgeous country. And I'm totally retired. I've had a few health issues, haven't we all? I think I moved one too many tent platforms at Buckeye and Tuscaloosa. So I don't get out of bed very easily in the morning. Let's just put it that way. Let's talk a little bit about the transition.
Kirk, before you move on, you mentioned several different camps by name. Were they summer camps or were they camp properties within the various councils, but not summer camp?
Summer camps.
Okay.
Yeah. Some owned, some not owned. In the early years, it was kind of interesting. Usually it was a one-year lease that they took on a property and camped there. Really, there weren't any owned properties until well into the 20s. But yeah, there's some very interesting stuff about Camp Owens out of the Harding area, the former Harding area council, Marion. They actually had a camp planners program for a short period of time. I'm not sure exactly how long. I'm trying to nail that down. Firecrafters out of the Kansas City area, which was one of the 5 big ones, along with Pipestone. So interesting twist there. On the transition, I want to take sort of a long view because it isn't just the move from Buckeye to Tuscaloosa to Seven Ranges. The council summer camping program was in transition for a long time. And it was difficult. It was difficult the whole way through. It was a difficult decision to transition. It was a difficult transition of where to transition to and how to do it. Had difficulties with community buy-in, and even in our scouting community, it was not an easy thing to get buy-in. So it was tough, and there were detours along the way. But I think we need that background to understand where we're at. You know, the general direction was set in the early 60s, in that the decision was made that we would eventually have to move out of Tuscaloosa. And it was really apparent. It was actually formalized in a 1968 council study committee that found that the 2 existing camps were not suitable for continued use. So that far back, the decision had been made. The decision was to acquire and develop a new property. Where could we have gone? Oh, we had a lot of options. We actually started down a couple different paths. We had an option on a property near Delroy, not too far from Tuscaloosa. And we pulled out of that because they actually did some soil testing and found out that the proposed lake that they were going to put in wouldn't hold water. So that one got pulled. Another one, we actually got further down the road with Winterset. We actually closed on Winterset in 1974. We purchased the acreage, except for a key 100-acre plot right in the middle that we absolutely needed. So it wasn't a very good plan. Would have been a really neat property. And I can tell a side story on this one. Eventually ended up auctioning it off. I think it was in '75. And they actually prearranged several wealthier council executive board members to step in and purchase at the minimums at the auction if it became necessary. One of those was the 1959 Camp Tuscaloosa camp director, Dr. Roger Vincent, who also eventually became the OA lodge advisor. He ended up purchasing about 160 acres, and he did it as a charitable contribution in essence. But the joke was on him and the council. 2 years later, somebody came through, did a seismic survey, and began purchasing the oil and gas rights. It was so rich in oil and gas that Dr. Vincent ended up recouping the entire purchase price in 2 years. Can't fault him. He's been very generous with his contributions financially to the council. We could have ended up with a YMCA camp. We actively considered that. We had 3 different properties on Lake Clendenin that we had considered purchasing. Akron had a property there, Akron Council. Cleveland Council had a property, and Fort Steuben Council had a property there. We opted not eventually to do any of those. You know, the council had huge financial difficulties for many, many years. Beginning in the early 60s through most of the 70s, the council was probably technically bankrupt in that we owed a heck of a lot more money than we had in assets. Even though we had, in the end, close to $1 million in assets on the books. Somebody was pretty smart in that if you want to avoid bankruptcy, the best thing to do if you're a nonprofit is to get the federal bankruptcy judge to sit in on your executive committee, or your executive board. And so that's one thing that we did. It was kind of sneaky, but clever at the same time. With all that said, Tuscaloosa was mortgaged. I don't know that a lot of people know this. It was mortgaged for much more than they eventually sold it to the Kimballs for. It was mortgaged in '74, and it took till late '76 to pay off the mortgage through fundraising. By '77, the financial crisis had eased a great deal. But in the meantime, there was a great deal of timbering, firewood sales, oil and gas leases at Tuscaloosa and Buckeye, imperiling both the camps. 70s saw a great deal of growth in the amount of camping that we were doing. At the same time, we added the handicap camping programs, particularly at Buckeye. Even in developing the Aspen Grove campsite between the chapel and the Nature Lodge. And that set precedent for developing a handicap site at 7 ranges. With the financial crisis, there was massive deterioration at both camp facilities. Matter of fact, from the mid 60s through 1978, there was absolutely nothing done as far as maintenance except for emergency repairs. And even then, sometimes those didn't happen. The 1975 dining hall fire at Camp Tuscaloosa was another blow, and it had some financial repercussions too. In '77, a major program change happened in that the Visitors Night program was canceled on an ongoing basis to provide some programming flexibility. And because of the deteriorated camp facilities and the impacts on camp program, actually, um, we really suffered in our camp inspection ratings. In 1975, it was so bad that Camp Tuscazor received a C rating, which means that it was only marginally acceptable to camp there. And to be honest, from what I could find out, that C rating was a gift, because the regional camp inspectors felt that it didn't quite meet the C. Matter of fact, the citation, I did okay with B's, not A's, but B's. And Tuscazor turned it around the next year. And so 76 through 78, they got their B ratings. Interesting was the citation from the regional camp inspection indicated serious deficiencies due to age and overuse, something that the council had been saying for a long time. Council moved to acquire a new property and develop it. Winterset was behind us. And they actually approached the Capital Campaigns Committee of Central Star. And Central Star turned them down on any capital campaign because they felt that our facilities were adequate. So the council then had to dig in and document conditions, needs, and basically educate the powers that be as to the scouting aims and methods and how our facilities were inadequate to do that. And so there were a series of studies, and eventually ended up with a long-range plan from 75 to 86 that documented our needs and put us on a path forward. And one of the things was it eventually identified the Donnahaven tree farm, which then we acquired, and it became 7 ranges. But I think what we need to say real quick is that there were some major voices from the camp staff, historical and current, while all of this was happening. I have to point out Ralph Colson, Dan Miller as ranger, myself, Chris Andrews, Dr. Roger Vincent, and Fred Gray were instrumental on the long-range plan and eventually on the camping study committee. And you can add Brad Bowersox in the later parts of that. So we had, as camp staffers, had a great deal of input into the physical transition and the direction that we were going. There were slight impacts that we had on program, but that was more actually a different group of camp staffers. So that's the historical background on physically how we got where we got.
Eric, was the driving impetus the financial situation, the growth of scouting and the need for more space, or the deterioration of the facilities, or some combination of all that?
It was all of it. But it was recognized going into the late 50s that in fact we were peaking on membership, peaking on camping, and we didn't have the facilities for it. And it was determined that you couldn't develop Tuscazor because of the terrain, because of the water situation, because of the lack of recreational water, that you just couldn't go forward that way.
I think
interestingly, the Save Our Camps Committee and the loyal opposition to abandoning Tuscazor and Buckeye made a case, but it just didn't hold up. So there was a very difficult buy-in. But yes, deterioration, finances, lack of development. Yeah, it was great for the 20s and the 30s, but even into the 40s, it was limitations, physical limitations to the camp, and that was the greatest one, and the program impacts. I can't believe how great a program was able to be given despite the physical limitations.
I think a hard pill to swallow for a lot of people, and it wasn't until a chance to look back in retrospect to understand it, was that, you know, if we truly believe what it is we believe in terms of scouting and our responsibility to the land and to, you know, if we truly believe that, then it would have become obvious to a lot of people that we were really just destroying the property. You know, erosion, the constant trying to put new roads in to expand things. It was just, we were hurting the land more than we were helping it. And I think, you know, in retrospect, it's easy now to look back and say it's a wonderful property now, and we all enjoy visiting it, but there's just no way that we could have sustained the program that we have now on that property without doing serious damage to the land.
Well, and remember, the camp, Tuscaloosa was developed when the whole philosophy was primarily provisional style camping. It wasn't troop and patrol camping. And it just became a series of modifications to try to get there, and it was never successful.
Right, right.
Kirk, I had never heard about Tuscaloosa having been mortgaged. Was the funds from the mortgage to purchase some of the other options you talked about, or was it just to cover regular expenses for the council?
Let's put it this way, and obviously the scale's a little different today, but back then $35,000 owed on employee withholding to the IRS get you in a great deal of trouble. Mm. And that was just a small slice of the problems they were having. You know, I have to bring up Bill Ryan. Bill was brought in as scout executive after Joe Macy because he was the program guy. And Bill would spend money that the council didn't have on the program. And that eventually caught up. And that's how we got Cliff Mansley. Mm-hmm. You couldn't ask for a better program guy than Bill Ryan.
Yeah, it's kind of, some of what you're saying is kind of fun, because I remember being on staff in the early 80s on the flip side of those negative scores, and you know, the things we did to make certain that we as the camp staff did, partially as a thumb to the council, to make certain that we did get the A ratings. And I specifically remembering one fire extinguisher around to multiple buildings just ahead of the inspectors.
Yes. It was our version of the fire brigade.
And, you know, there's a silver lining to the horrible inspection scores and the commentary on them. Those were used with the Capital Campaign Committee of Central Start to convince them that, in fact, we needed to replace it.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense.
What prompted the sale of Buckeye?
Let me say this as politely as possible.
Just 9 of us.
Those that are going to watch it on recording later.
It primarily was because the Central Start Capital Campaigns Committee says, okay, we agree. We still have too many camping facilities serving the central Stark County area. Therefore, if you're going to get a new one, if we're going to agree to help you fund your new facility, you're going to sell everything else you got. So it was a quid pro quo. You want $1 to $2 million of community support, you're going to sell Tuscaloosa and Buckeye.
So they were lumped together.
Yes.
I don't believe is that totally true, Kirk? This is Gene. You remember I worked at the council at that time when those decisions were made and as a district executive. So, well, not exactly as a district executive yet then. It was a complicated mess, but
Yeah,
I'm not disagreeing with your history, but there was a lot more politics in it than, as you well know.
Oh, absolutely. And that's the most polite way that I can say that.
I know. And also it's interesting because I'm surprised that, of course, I'm an old guy now, so I don't remember a lot. I can't even remember what happened yesterday, but I don't remember about the mortgage exactly, and I should have known that having worked there. But I'm not saying that didn't happen. I'm not here to disagree or agree. I just find it interesting. I mean, I know that we had financial problems because in my last years of working there, I actually was the director of camping. I got that position and was leaned on a couple of times to take profit money and give it back to the council, but that didn't happen because I leaned in a different direction, but nobody knew it at the time. So,
yeah.
But during that whole time, we as professionals were always leaned on to, because I served Carroll County at the time, and they weren't under United Way and all that. So it was very difficult. You know, I was told, well, you can't go there. If they don't give us any money, you can't go there. And I said, if I don't go there, you can't get any money. So I was one of the first people that actually got them to give under the campaign. You know, I forget what we called it back then, but not for the camp. I mean, just for the council in general, much long before any mergers or anything else took place. So it's all ancient history now.
Yeah, the whole United Way situation with the council being across portions of 5 counties.
Yeah, and of course, we only served half, the northern half of Tuscarawas County, I think it was, and yeah, another council held the lower half, and that made it more difficult, you know.
Right.
And that United Way paid in, but the other county didn't have a United Way.
And we had the same situation in Alliance. Right. It got so bad, went without a district exec there for a long time, and they talked in several years. And finally, our excuse, the council's excuse was, you're not serving us, you're not providing a district executive, we're not going to give you any money.
Right.
And then we said, as a council, we're not going to give you an executive because you're not giving us any money. So, you know, it was a circular firing squad for a while. Eventually, council finagled things and put a district executive, at least in name.
Well, one of the ways that we got around it was I was lucky enough that I went out and approached Bernie Myers, and I said, hi, I need a district chairman that can get a few things done. And since you've already been a council chairman once, I think you're the guy, even though I wasn't supposed to be the nominating committee. And then he marched over with me to the other county and got them to give the money.
Yeah.
For general operating, not camp. I mean, that was long before we even knew a camp was going to be there, you know. But
you know, in '75, a big chunk of money that was surplus from the camp operations did go into the council's general fund.
Yes, but I wasn't involved directly with that.
Right.
I knew that it, you know, I worked for both Bill Ryle and the other people, so I knew them both pretty well, you know.
Yeah.
In fact, I was working as a camp director under Bill Ryle, so.
Right.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, we all fought against that, but you were right. I mean, we needed the money, so I don't
Yeah.
know. I mean, do we let just history lie? Maybe that's the best thing. I don't mean lie. I just mean just leave it alone and let history be what it is rather than drum it up because there's nothing we can do about fixing history.
Yeah, pretty much. You know, the situation's far more complicated than I made it. Let me tell you, there were a lot of oxes gored.
Well, I know I was involved in them, especially because of our involvement at Camp Buckeye, you know, so there was a lot more going on that never got told, you know.
Yeah.
Yep.
And there was a lot of other options at the time too, but they couldn't be pursued for a number of reasons.
Yeah, for example, we couldn't pick up, was it Euler or Oyster? Oyer, the farm just right next to Buckeye, the dairy farm.
Well, not only that, they also had the Muskingum watershed land. We had in fact, the OA circle actually sat out, not the circle, but one of the ceremony sites was actually out on their land. We had permission to use that and expand, but then that became a political problem. You know, that comes into the old history and all that.
Yeah. And in the adjacent farm, we actually were partway down pursuing that.
Right.
The problem is he had just signed a 20-year contract for milk production with one of the big dairies.
Right.
And
Right.
we would have had to have bought that out, and it was a huge amount of money.
Right.
What are the origins of Buckeye, and how long did the council own that, and how did that come about? I've heard the origins of Tuscazor, the role of Chief Deaver, but what's the history of Buckeye in there? Since we've got some Buckeye folks here to educate us.
I believe, Kirk, didn't it come? It came as a part of the Maslin Council, didn't it?
It did. Purchased in 45 or 46, maybe. We had just gotten a new scout executive, C. Stuart Ryla, who was originally started out as a district exec in the Columbus Council. He came up. We had for a number of years operated a leased property, a camp outside of Winesburg, Ohio. And I may be butchering the name, and I can never find the spelling on it officially. It was called Anacomawakia, Kiwa, something close to that. Everybody referred to it as Camp AW. And it was a number of years there, and they actually did some development. But again, it was a site that had severe limitations. There was no way into the central camp. It was across a huge ravine. And actually, the only way in, they had to build a suspension bridge, a pioneering extension bridge, and hand carry all materials in.
Wow.
But, you know, it is what it was. And again, it was a lack of finances, and they found a property that they could use and were able to afford. And a good time was had. It was a great camp. But the move was to Buckeye. It wasn't called Buckeye at first. It wasn't called anything at first. That was the brainchild of Stu Ryla. Called it Camp Buckeye and changed the council name from Maslin Area Council to Buckeye Council. And they actually officially on the record speak Buckeye Area Council. But he got some funding, and the bulk of the camp, as it was originally developed, and swimming pool didn't come right away, but the bulk of the camp was built on World War II surplus goods. Who would go down to Columbus with a big truck owned by one of the industries, and he'd just buy with what few dollars the council had any possible surplus war materials that could be put to use. And I think camp operated for the first time in 46. It really was an outpouring of community support that built it, both in manpower, materials, and funds.
I think wasn't the Rangers house there that was built later. That was built from lumber from the camp.
It
although
was.
and although I can't remember the longtime Rangers name there, I should after all the years I worked there. But I never went in his house, only in the basement because that's where the water came from.
Yeah.
From that well. But as I remember stepping into his porch, all that was hand-hewed lumber inside there that came.
Yeah.
Now, I have old pictures from some of the buildings in the 40s and 50s. So.
And I think you're talking about Clint Baldwin.
Yeah.
Right.
The
Yeah.
name,
And interesting side note, whoever harvested the lumber, there was a good amount of standing dead timber on camp because the chestnut blight tore through there. And so there's this wonderful wormy chestnut through much of the house. And one of Clint's predecessor's wives couldn't stand the wormholes, so cutting each of those holes.
Yeah.
Anyways, yeah, that's the long and the short of the story. Just as to orient folks, what was the quartermaster trading post thing was originally the dining hall.
Right.
And the dining hall that we know on Singer Lodge was not constructed till 60, 61.
Right.
And that was almost exclusively funded by Atlee C. Hunsinger.
Yes. He did a lot of extra stuff there, and you never knew it because he didn't want it to be known.
No, I think he was a little taken aback when his name suddenly appeared in the.
Right. I met him once because only a couple of times, but once all those canvas deck chairs showed up on the front of the porch one day, and there was an old guy, so to speak. Now we're all old guys, but I said, "Pardon me, but I need to know who you are." And he said, "My name's up on the top of the building," and that's all he said. That's all he said to me. And I went to Clint and I said, "You know what's going on?" He said, "He bought all them chairs, so he has a right to sit in one of them." And I never really got to know the guy, really. But if you needed something, Clint would get in touch with him and it would be taken care of.
Yeah, and
But he said he had come by and he said, I don't want to see all these scoutmasters standing up waiting to get into the dining hall. So he said, I bought enough to cover each campsite for two adults or something like. I forget how it went, but that's how those chairs, as a part of history goes, that's how all those chairs arrived there.
Yeah, and he basically was the grandfather of the ox roast.
Right. Yes.
Which saved the council's hiney more than once.
Many times.
Originally, the swimming at Buckeye was in Bucky's Pond. I know it's a hard concept, but Bucky's Pond was not always murky and green and slimy and what have you. It actually was a pretty good swimming hole in the early years. But they decided that, and I think it had to do with some sewage leakage from latrines.
Right.
Actually constructed the shower houses and the swimming pool.
Well, they also had, once they constructed that, we had leakage from that going into the pond too, but.
Yeah.
And then the diverted water. Remember how we used to try to dig a trench across and put pipe in to get that, because the pool was filled by that spring water. You had a big valve up there and everybody's like, how's it comes it so cold? And I said, because it comes out from that hill. And we tried to divert that to get it over to the pond, but we Today, we'd have just called somebody up and said, dig us a trench, but
Yep.
we tried to do it the old fashioned way.
Gene, what years were you active at Buckeye?
In the 70s, I don't remember the exact years. I still own one of Camp Buckeye's old canoes that still has their emblem on it.
Okay.
Oh, nice.
Because when we bought all the new canoes and the canoe trailers, remember we were all doing the canoeing. I think we had them at both camps. So they instructed me to sell them off, so I bought one and I brought it with me to Florida. So I
Great.
still have that piece of memorabilia if somebody'd like to hang it somewhere. People have tried to buy it from me because it's aluminum. So I mean,
Yeah.
Gene,
I remember those. I think I took canoeing merit badge in one of those things. So
Mhm.
yeah.
Gene,
Jim?
you were there in '68 when I started on staff.
I was.
Yep.
Okay.
and you were definitely there 74 through 78.
Right.
Yes.
Well, the last year that it was open, that's when I was the director of camping, I think, or something, but I wasn't the camp director that year. My
You
father
responsible
asked
very
me pardon me?
Gene, were you responsible for hiring Jim Kassler?
Unfortunately, yes. But I owe him an apology too.
We all make
because
mistakes.
I owed him an apology because I talked him down on salary in order to get him. So I apologize in public to you for paying you less than you deserved. But yes, you couldn't have asked for a better worker.
What,
course, he
what
had a
years were
good-
you on
he-
staff, Jim?
So yeah, he hired me in '76 to be the camp commissioner, and I had to take over a job that Carl Behrens had before that. If anybody knows Carl Behrens,
yeah.
he was this big, huge bear of a guy that was very jovial and would go around and really make an impression on people. So I had big shoes to fill, but
Literally.
I think yeah, literally. But I think it worked out.
You know, Jim, how he got there, right?
How's
I
that?
didn't know it for years later, but when they asked me to be camp director, they thought it was a good idea, but they thought I was a little too young at the time. So I think Bill Ryle or one of them went out and found Carl to come and work to give us a little more seniority. And although he didn't have an official position, because he was like, twice my age, he was put on there in order to bring some maturity to the thing. But we got along well. I mean, he had that old school teacher. He was in the school system. I think he was a shop teacher, wasn't he? I can't remember. And then we brought his son on later. So
Yeah, Bill ran the rifle range that first year I was there, and
right.
of course I'm a 19-year-old kid going around trying to pick up for whatever Carl was, a 60-year-old guy, and you always get that, oh, you're the camp commissioner. Okay, well, we'll see what happens. But it was a lot of fun.
You did a good job.
So the councils merged in '57, and Buckeye became part of the Buckeye Council, and McKinley Area Council moved, and that's when Buckeye got Pipestone, and Tuscazor got the OA, and everybody kind of married and got together and became one big happy family then, huh?
I think so.
Kirk, do you know, I hear these rumors about at Buckeye, the activity field that used to be used for football practice for the Massillon Tigers.
That's
Is
correct.
that's a
That is
fact?
correct.
Okay. What kind
And
of
the Girl
era
Scouts-
was that done in?
Oh, God. That was in the early 50s, late 40s, early 50s. I'd have to do some checking to get you some better dates, but yeah. And the Girl Scouts used Camp Buckeye too. That was their summer camp also. Matter of fact, the Nature Lodge was the Girl Scout Lodge and was their exclusive use for the number of years that they used Camp Buckeye.
So they were there simultaneously with us?
No, Uh, the 7, 8, 9, 10, 12-week summer camp season is a relatively recent phenomenon in the long history. If you had 4 weeks of summer camp, that was spectacular for a summer camp season. So the Scouts would do 4 weeks, and the Girl Scouts would do 3 weeks, or something along those lines.
Yep. Great.
Jim, how long were you on staff then?
I was there the last 3 years that Buckeye was open, 76, 7, and 8. Worked for Gene the first 2 years. I had a great time. And then Jerry Mon was there. He was brought over from Tuscaloosa to run Buckeye its last year to just kind of get his feet wet being a camp director. And then, of course, he went to Tuscaloosa and was the camp director after the merger for quite a while after that then.
Yeah,
What was that like in that era of time with Buckeye closing and Tuscaloosa? There was maybe animosity, some too strong. I don't know. I was a kid through part of that.
Well, anytime you close anything that's been a tradition, you're going to have problems. That continues today, and it's hard to get away from that. The tie that binds us all together is Pipestone, and as much as people complain, I'm never leaving Buckeye, or I'm never leaving Tuscaloosa, or whatever it is, they're always going to follow the Camp Honors program. So, fortunately, we've had that to keep people together. And I think because of that, and the fact that the traditions between the two camps really weren't all that different. The atmosphere was different between Tuscaloosa and Buckeye. Buckeye had a much more laid back, comfortable kind of a feel to it. Tuscaloosa was, a little more regimented. There were a lot more people there, so it had to be. But the traditions were the same. We all sang the same songs. We all did the same skits. Camp staff members went back and forth. Campers went back and forth. So it kind of helped just, make them one throughout their existence. So when we all went to Tuscaloosa, nobody had to really get used to anything new for the most part, because it was still the same old thing as far as the program goes. People complain. The people at Buckeye complain about going up and down the hills at Tuscaloosa, but they had a pretty good hill that they had there too. So it wasn't all, it was more for show than anything.
I think, Jim, in those first couple of years, the tying buying was certainly Pipestone, but I think the quality of the program in both camps was also a hallmark that kept things going. There was a level of quality of the staffs and of the instruction and of the singing and the dining hall and that kind of stuff that was common to both camps, and that's really what we grabbed onto during the transition from Tuscaloosa to Seven Ranges. And it was the whole idea that there was that tradition. Besides the property itself, there was that tradition in the program and in the staffs that kind of kept us going forward.
Yeah, and I think our people expected that kind of quality too. They had been used to it for a long time. We were very fortunate to have a lot of people that kept raising the bar at camp. And so it was, that's why we attracted people from outside the council as well. Everybody knows that we were always getting people from Great Trail and Cleveland and other Pittsburgh and other places to come here. And I don't think it was just because of the Pipestone program. I think it was just because of our great program, and the people that ran it. So that's been the tradition for a long time at all of our camps.
And nobody
We're
wants to
very
be,
fortunate.
yeah, nobody wants to be part of the group that drops the ball.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Where did the images of Bucky and Icky come from? They're sort of drawn the same. Brian, your dad did Hutch and the Indian. Did he do Bucky and Icky?
He did Bucky and Icky too.
When did
yeah,
they come about?
Well, okay. So let me just kind of, they came about, let me pull this up here. There you go. There's Dad right there. So Dad's, and at the time, interesting, Kirk, because Dad was also on the executive committee at some point in time, and he was also part of the camp inspection teams that would go around to other camps as well. So they're meeting there. So Dad, and there's Icky right there. Dad wanted to find an image that he had designed some patches for the camp. And as a matter of fact, over the years, finally, I think it was, I totaled it up one time. It was something like 34 patches for the Buckeye Council and for over the years. And they were kind of looking for an image that would kind of speak to the staffers. And of course, Pioneer Point, it's always been talked about that Pioneer Point was an Indian, part of an Indian trail, and that then there were in fact native trails that went right through the property, and they've been documented in a lot of it was a route from Sandusky to southern, in the middle of Ohio and down into West Virginia, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, that went right through the camp. And the idea of the Indian Scout kind of came to him and a number of other people. And so he developed this figure. Now, it didn't have a name initially. It was just an Indian Scout. And you saw him in various places. There's one from the McKinley Area Council that you see him front on there. And then later on, probably one of the more famous, oh yeah, there you go. That was one of the camperall patches where you'd earn a different part of the patch for different activities. And eventually he drew a picture of him. There's Icky sitting on the rock at Pioneer Point. And he didn't have a name initially, and I don't know exactly when it happened. And Kirk, I don't know whether you have information on this or not, but sometime in the late 40s, the character was invented, I think, in 46 or something like that. Sometime in the late 40s, some campers were camping on what would be the wilderness section of Tuscazor, and they came across a cave, and they explored the cave, and they found some bones, and they found some metal pot, and they found some items, and the scoutmasters were smart enough to realize that was an interesting find. And so they pulled the kids out and they roped it off, and they called the county, and the county eventually connected with Kent State University, and they sent people down to explore. And one thing they found was a pot, and the pot had an inscription on the bottom, and the first two initials were IC, and then the bottom two initials were KY. And in doing some research, what they found was that there was a foundry in Kentucky, KY, that was owned by a gentleman, I forget his name, but his initials were IC. And he would stamp his pots with an IC and then a KY, because the foundry was from Kentucky. And they had done some research, and while it's never been fully proven, they came to the conclusion that at some point in time, the son of an elder of a tribe in Sandusky was sent along the trail to try to bring a message to one of the tribes, I think probably in West Virginia. They were talking about merging and whatnot. And somewhere along the way, he had stopped at camp and he had injured himself, and the bones bear out the fact that he had a very serious injury. He had broken a leg at some point in time. But they surmised that he had done some trading along the way, because that was not unusual time for the Indians to be trading with the white settlers at that point in time. There were not that many of them, and that in the process he traded for and got a pot, but his injuries were too grave, and he huddled into a cave, and eventually he died, and the cave collapsed over in a rainfall or something, and it wasn't discovered until later on. And so once that story came out, the ICKY became the Icky that gave the Indian his name. And so he became Icky. And later on, I'm not sure who asked him to, but they decided that since Tuscaloosa had a mascot, if you will, Icky, that Buckeye needed one, and so he developed Bucky. Let me see if I can find a picture. Yeah, I got Icky, and there you go. There's Icky and Bucky there. Icky represented Tuscaloosa, and Bucky represented Buckeye. When Bucky came along, I'm not quite sure. And for a while, you notice this particular design, Buckeye Council Camps staff, and both staffs use that design. Both Tuscaloosa and Buckeye use that design throughout the years, off and on. That particular design was probably used about 6 or 7 times, and it became a patch. So that's where those two came along. And I think probably, with political correctness and people being much more sensitive and cultural approbation and whatnot, you could probably argue the character of Icky certainly was not meant to be a condescending term. Dad always treated him with a lot of respect. And it was kind of meant to be the heart and soul of the camp, and not meant to be looked at as a caricature. It was borrowed, I think, a number of times by other artists who reworked it without Dad's approval necessarily. But there are only 2 or 3 particular images. There's one picture of Icky and Bucky sitting there with a bunny rabbit in between of them. I'm not quite sure when that one came out, but that was not something that Dad did himself. So it made sense to Dave Durrell during the transition from Tuscaloosa into Seven Ranges to talk to Dad about the idea of trying to find a figure who would speak to Seven Ranges as well. And so Dave was a historian. He taught history and was very much interested in exploring the history of the Seven Ranges area. And he was responsible for a lot of the lore that came out of there. And so we sat down with Dad, and I will say this, initially Dad was not particularly on board with the idea of transitioning from Tuscaloosa to Seven Ranges in the initial stages. And I was talking to Kirk about this, and part of it, from having had conversations of it, were less about the need and more about what he perceived to be the way that it was handled. And so for a while he was not a fan of the process, but Dave knew Dad well. Dad had stopped designing patches somewhere in the mid 70s, I think. And Dave went to him, and they had a number of conversations. And the first time Dad kicked him out of the house, as I recall. But the second time he sat down and started talking about it, and Dad saw his passion, and he eventually realized that this was a done thing. And if we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. And so he kind of threw his weight behind. And so Dave brought him a lot of what he discovered about the history of the camp. And from there, 2 figures came out of the history of the whole thing. Oops, there we go. That's another one Dad's design. It's a Busy Beaver. And so he would ask Dad if he would design the final patch for Tuscaloosa, and then the first patch for Seven Ranges. And Dad said he would do it. This patch actually was meant to be the last year of Tuscaloosa. It was supposed to be 85, but the problem was there was a problem with the dam. It had a leak, and they had to postpone the opening. So this was the original patch. And it was kind of meant to be, it's suggestive of the 2 Indians standing at Pioneer Point looking over their shoulder, sort of looking to the past before moving on to the future. And that was his original idea with this particular patch. And so what was decided was that we needed some kind of transition from Tuscaloosa into Seven Ranges. And Dave got the program directors of each of the various program areas to commit to at least 2 years the last year of Tuscaloosa and the first year of Seven Ranges. So there'd be a continuity of staff. And the three things that Dave really wanted to focus on were the quality of the program, the traditions and which traditions we could bring with us, and also some kind of a character or a figure that we could latch onto. He felt those three were kind of important aspects. And so in digging, he came across two figures here. One's a gentleman by the name of George Grohan. And George Grohan was actually an Irish immigrant. He immigrated to Pennsylvania in the mid 1740s, and he was a trader, Trader, and worked a lot with he went around with the various native tribes and learned their languages, got to know their customs, and eventually actually married the daughter of a Mohawk chief. He became at one point in time what they referred to as a sachem, which is a word for a leader. He was in effect a chief, elevated almost to the status of chief, and so eventually he was made an emissary between the colonial government at the time and the various Indian tribes in the area, and so he actually helped to acquire certain rights and lands for a lot of the native people in the Ohio area. Later on, he was accused of treason and was imprisoned for a while. But when he was finally let go, he was not allowed to return to his land in Ohio. But he crossed paths then with Thomas Hutchins, and Hutchins was. He originally was 16 years old. He was actually served in the British Army and kind of worked his way up in the British Army and became a chief engineer in the Western Department of North America. Did a lot of expeditions with the Army there, and eventually met Grohan before Grohan actually was banned from the area here. But during his time serving with the British Army, he became an American sympathizer to the cause of American independence. And so he kind of kept it to himself and played it close to the vest. But eventually there were rumors of him being a traitor, and he was imprisoned for a while, and he escaped to France. And eventually later he came back and joined the American Army. He's he's believed to be the only British regular officer to have switched sides during the war, and became a British officer. And eventually Congress approached him because of his connections with the Indians in the area through Grohan to be the geographer and the surveyor for the Army. And later on, George Washington in the 1780s, 85, somewhere there. Grohan had already passed away at that point in time, but Washington had named him the geographer general, and then later on the surveyor general. And his final assignment then was to survey what were called the Seven Ranges, which are the townships where they are now, for the Land Ordinance Act of 1785. And so he did this for 2 years and was very successful because of the connections that he had through Grohan with the native tribes. And he died while he was in the middle of the surveying. So Hutch became the key figure. He was the one who actually laid out the Seven Ranges. And so Dave went to Dad and said, I need a figure. I need a Hutch figure because we want to develop our program. Tuscaloosa has Icky, Buckeye has Bucky. And if you know anything about, obviously, if you've been to Gnadenhutten or Schönbrunn, those areas, you've heard all the stories of the native settlers and I forget which chief it was, but apparently one of the American or one of the white settlers struck a deal with the chief who allowed him to buy a plot of land, and the settler was very tall, but the chief was very short, and so the settler marched off his property, and the chief stopped and said, "No, I'm marching it off," and that story became kind of a famous story, and so. There was not that same kind of connection, but Durrell kind of envisioned Hutch having a guide with him, perhaps a native guide with him. And so I'll get back to this in a second here, this patch here. And so he came up with the idea of Sorry, get me through my little slideshow here. He came up with the idea of Hutch as the surveyor and with the Indian looking over his shoulder. And so that became the patch for the first year of 7 ranges in 87. And so that patch has been used in various forms. It probably stayed the same for about 3 or 4 years with just the color changing. And a number of other patches were designed. And now initially, because the property was a reservation and it has several camps on it, I'm trying to find it. Oh, that's one that Dad did for the later on. I don't think I have it here. But eventually there were 3 patches, one for 7 ranges, one for Algonquin, and one for Calumet. And they were designed as a 3-patch collection. And you could get those in the first couple of years. But once Dave and Dad had this, the next step was to figuring out the transition from the 2 camps. And what a lot of people don't know is that apparently, Dave had known this was coming for a number of years. And somewhere, Mark, you can help me out with this. It was probably 3 or 4 years before Tuscarora's last year. We decided to do a Wednesday night campfire program. It was after we no longer had parents' night, or big sister night, as we sometimes called it. And so we needed to have programs there. And so we decided to take the camp on a trip out to wilderness. And we built a campfire area on the hillside out there. There were a number of fallen trees that had kind of crossed over and kind of formed a natural background. And we developed a campfire program. Dave Wagner got a large generator. I'm not going to ask where he got it from, but he got it. We ran hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of feet of cable from that over the next valley, put a tarp over it so you couldn't hear it, and then ran them up and put lights all over, backlighting. And so in the middle of this campfire, as certain elements of the Tuscarora history were recounted, silhouettes would appear and backlighted all over the place, some in the tree and some in the area behind, and they would illuminate and illustrate the stories. And it was a pretty successful campfire. So we decided for the final year at Tuscarora, we would do the same thing in a little more developed form. And we figured the best place to do that would be at Troop 5 Cabin. And so the idea for the last year's patch was this one here. And the philosophy that Dave had was that all those things we were worried about that, we're leaving behind can all be kind of enveloped in what we call the spirit of Tuscarora, the spirit of scouting at the time. All the stories of the people on the land, all the camp staff, the program, all this stuff, it's not going to be lost. It's going to be brought with us because it's all becomes part of that spirit. And so this black figure in the doorway, this unnamed figure, became the spirit of Tuscarora, the spirit of camping. And so he's shown in the porch there. And so what we decided to do on Sunday night, we decided to invent a pretext to get everybody to Troop High's cabin later on in the week. And so what we did was we made a very large banner in the shape of, that's the actual patch itself. We made a very large banner in the shape of the patch with the door open, and it was rolled up on top of Hoover Lodge. And during the campfire, we slowly raised it so nobody could hear it being raised. And in the middle of the campfire, 3/4 of the way through, a voice started interfering with the campfire, kind of coming in and out. We couldn't figure out where it came from because we had speakers all over the place. They came from different areas. And eventually it interrupted 3 or 4 times. And eventually we kind of got everybody settled down listening to it. And it was this disembodied voice that was asking all the questions that people have been asking for the last 2 years. I mean, how are we going to survive? What's going to happen? And eventually, somehow we drew their attention behind there. And in that process, Brian Linder, who was one of the shorter ones on staff, had climbed up on top of Hoover Lodge, stood up behind the doorway with a backlight. And you see him there in that picture. That's him standing behind there. He took the place of the spirit. And then he reached out, and with the gesture of his hand, he did this motion gesture. And then he pointed his hand out toward the direction of Troop 5 Cabin. And so we spent the next couple of days in the dining hall trying to figure out what this all meant. And we all came to the conclusion that we're all going to go to Troop High's cabin and figure out what it was. And when we got to Charlie's cabin Wednesday night, we started having a campfire with songs, all kinds of stuff. And eventually, all of a sudden, the lights came on inside the cabin, and this shadowy figure walked out to the front porch and stood there with a lantern. And we hear his thoughts coming back up, and he starts reliving the past and all of the people that were on the land, Ma Shungren and Delp and Deaver and the miners, the coal miners there, the iron miners, the iron miners and the Zorites and whatnot, and the native tribes. And as he was thinking to himself about all these people, these images would pop up all over the place with backlighting in a very slow pantomime. And eventually what happened is that he walked out on the porch, the spirit did, and you couldn't see him because it was all in black. And he stood there, and the figures all disappeared, and about 10 seconds later they reappeared on the far valley, on the uphill side of the far valley, and they started walking with a backlight, and they one by one they joined each other, and they kept walking out of camp in the direction of where Seven Ranges was. And then the spirit picked up the lantern and stepped down off the porch and walked down over the hill until he disappeared. And what you didn't see was on the other side of the hill, we had a separate camper who was much taller, who had his own lantern, who picked it up and reappeared and then followed them out of camp. The idea being that the spirit and all those things were going to travel with you. They were going to be there. And so the first year of Seven Ranges, what we did was for the Sunday night campfire, we built two large screens. This was the one on the left. You notice the spirit's not there. And the one on the right was a blank screen. And our camp doctor, who was also a photographer, as the kids came into camp, would take pictures all day long, slides, and he would develop them over dinner. And towards the end of the campfire, we would introduce them to the character of Hutch. We brought him on as kind of a comic character, I guess. And then later on, they start to see pictures of themselves popping up on the screen to the right in camp, and they're checking in and doing all kinds of other stuff. And eventually, Hutch came out and walked across, and you saw the spirit of, he walked over towards the patch, and you see the spirit of Tuscaloosa all of a sudden pop up behind the patch, and we kind of ended the campfire there. So the idea was that we were finally home. I mean, all these things had come, and we were now home. And so it's kind of a quick way of, and then eventually that's the patch at night. Anyway, so that's kind of how Dad kind of considered that a little bit of this, not redemption for him, but he was really proud of the fact of being able to be part of that and help to create that and to make that transition from one to the other. So kind of a long story, I apologize, but the man who was really responsible for a lot of that was coordinating was Dave Durrell, because he's the one that put it all together in terms of a program. And I mentioned this, Jim, because that was the thing was always in the back of Dave's mind was he wanted it to be done in a way that really honored the quality of the programs that was at Buckeye and Tuscaloosa, the quality of the staff, the quality of the dining hall program, the quality of the singing, the quality of just the program in general. And so that's kind of, so we spent, Mark, over the course of two falls, we actually would have meetings with Dave and others, and we would plot out the whole scheme of things and how it was going to work. And there was a big script. We actually had it. There was a videotape of it. Twice it was videotaped on Wednesday night, and people actually came back to camp on Wednesday night because they wanted to see the program. That we're trying to find that it was recorded on. Actually, it was recorded on video on handheld VHS. So it was pretty poor quality. But we're trying to track it down. We know somebody has it, and Fred Gray is going to try to restore it if he can get a hold of it, put it in the archives. So anyway, enough of that.
That was great. And this one of the challenges to that is by the latter part of the summer, the word had spread, and we didn't know how to accommodate all the people that were coming down to watch that program.
Yeah, that's Wednesday night. I know.
It became sort of an entity unto its own.
Yeah. Yeah, we had to have people in the parking lot. Thanks, Jerry. Thanks for joining us. Good to see you again. Yeah, it became, it was a production.
Yeah.
But, it was that kind of, we wanted to launch things. The big question was, Dave didn't want to start too many traditions at Seven Ranges. He wanted to be able to bring as many over as we could. that were important, but he didn't want to start too many new ones because he really felt it was going to be up to the people that were staying and working there to develop those transitions. That's why we didn't have I think I mentioned it in previous reunion, we didn't have a camp alma mater for 4 or 5 years because we didn't feel that we could force that on people. I mean, Bill Sennheiser didn't write the Tuscaloosa hymn until the 1950s at some point in time. I think it was in the mid 50s. And so we didn't want to have any forced traditions on them or forced nostalgia on anybody. But the idea is what to bring along to keep the program running. So.
And, Brian, I might be able to solve a mystery.
Sure. There you go. That's probably the first. Yeah, I remember that. Thank you. There's Bucky at Buckeye leaning away.
Yep.
That could be the first year. I think you're right.
There's no 58. I know that.
Oops, Ralph. You're muted, Ralph. There you go.
It was definitely 59 because that was the first year that I was in camp, and I was at Camp Buckeye, and that was the first year that my troop moved from Tuscaloosa to Buckeye to be part of it that first year.
Interesting. And again, now that you jog my memory again, he didn't have a name for Bucky for the first year. There was no name for him. I think it kind of came organically over a certain amount of time.
And I have an apocryphal story on Icky's name too. Supposedly, one of the kids that discovered the bones said, "Ooh, that's Icky." So,
yeah. There is I've actually been in contact with Kent State trying to track down, because they no longer have an archaeological department, but they did find a record of ICKY, which is how the actual dig was labeled. That was the actual archaeologist's label on the dig, ICKY. But I have somebody who's trying to track down and to get me. There's a fuller story. It appeared in a small article in a paper in Dover, New Philly, back in I want to say the 60s at some point in time. And I know Rick Weber had a copy of it, and I'm trying to track it down because it tells it fleshes out and kind of I think a writer took the basic bones of the story and hypothesized about how it might have happened. And so, the story tells about the young scout's journey through the woods and things like that. And so it's all assumed and pretend, but the basic facts are there. So 59, thanks, Kirk.
I looked at the 58 stuff, and there's nothing from Buckeye in 58. Matter of fact, there's a generic carryover patch that has the Buckeye leaf from 58. So I'm almost positive 59 is the first. And I heard tidbits of a story that your dad was approached to do this because we needed not to put the two camps on equal par, but as a cohesion thing. And through the 70s, of course, 60s and 70s, we didn't have Camp Tuscaloosa or Camp Buckeye per se. They were the Buckeye Council camps.
Right.
In all the literature, all the publicity, all the patches, neckerchiefs, logos, whatever.
Right. Yep. So. As a little known fact, I'm gonna throw this in here just out of a certain amount of pride. My dad, a graphic artist and a commercial designer, and he's known for two particular designs that people don't know about. One of which is he designed the U.S. Steel logo, which eventually the Pittsburgh Steelers purchased, and it became the Pittsburgh Steelers logo. It's on their helmet. So he designed that, and the three dots represent the three components of making steel. And so it was slightly different in the original form with U.S. Steel, and when the Pittsburgh Steelers bought it, they simplified it a little bit, but that was Dad's design. And the other design he had was the United Way symbol, the little hand with the stick figure, or the figure and the rainbow going overhead. It was another one of Dad's designs. So
Neat.
Was that a local United Way or national?
he designed it for local, but apparently it was used nationally.
Yeah, that's what I was
Yeah.
thinking.
The thing about it was, unfortunately, he signed a contract with U.S. Steel, and so you can go through all of the materials, and you'll never find his name being mentioned. He got paid a flat rate for the U.S. Steel logo, but so you'll never see his name on the if you try to Google it. But I actually have a folder at home with his original artwork and a couple of letters that he signed with the company. So just goes to show you.
Wow, what an interesting night we've had with stories and history. It's been fascinating. So
I do want to hear a little, Mark, before you cut us off, I want to hear a little more from Jim on OA and the role of OA during all this time and the transitions from camp to camp. And because I know that he was.
Buckeye had the ox roast that was sort of adopted as the OA ox roast and was sort of known as the OA camp. Well, how did that come about, Jim?
Well, the Massillon Area Council was the one that had the OA Lodge. McKinley didn't have one. So Sippo Lodge started there in 47, and it didn't get to, what we have now until 57 when the councils merged. So Sippo Lodge started at Buckeye, and most of its traditions started there. First, then it moved to Tuscazor and was accepted throughout the council. I think most of the leaders still were Buckeye leaders for quite a while, holdovers from Buckeye until probably well into the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And then it just became more accepted throughout the council. That that's then when Seven Ranges started, we ended up taking the elements from Buckeye and Tuscazor, the altars that had been used at the ceremony circles, and we reconstructed them at Seven Ranges, one in each of the ceremony circles over there. So there's a Buckeye altar at one circle and a Tuscazor altar at the other circle. And Kirk was telling me last night that they have common tops on them from a quarry in Orville, you say, Kirk?
Yeah, it's Briar Hill Stone.
Yeah.
And that was it was donated by them to the offices of Elmer Blau, who was the lodge advisor at the time.
Hey, Jim, I'm going to interrupt just for a second because I want to hear more of the story. But you notice we've got Ben Seneth and Dan Nesbitt. They were joining us from National Camp School, where they're teaching program directors. Is that right, Dan? You're doing the program director thing, and I think they have to get going, but they wanted to say a quick hi to everybody here. You gonna unmute yourself there, Dan?
Hi.
Hey, guys.
We just wanted to say hi and good seeing you all. Gene Metzger, it's been a minute or so. How you doing, buddy?
I'm doing okay, thanks.
He's trying to figure out who the heck I am.
Dan
No,
Nesbitt.
I figured it out.
But,
It took me a while, but I got it figured out. I was more interested in all the history
Good seeing
because
you all tonight, and I hope you enjoyed our background.
Oh yeah.
So,
Happy belated birthday, Brian. Hope you like that video.
Oh, thanks.
bye, guys. Have a great evening.
You take care, guys.
Bye.
All right, Dan.
Take care. We'll see you.
See you guys. I got a little surprise real quick. I'm going to interject here. Dan Nesbitt, he loves to do the birthday song. This is your birthday song. It isn't very long. That's it. And he sings it and he sends it on Facebook to all his friends. And so yesterday, he and Ben, they got the entire camp school together in the parade grounds, and they all sang, "This is your birthday song. This isn't very long." And they all said, "Happy birthday, Brian." And he sent it to me, and I thought, wow. So anyway, Jim, sorry about that. So you're talking about
That's all
some transition to Seven Ranges.
Right. So yeah, we reconstructed the altars from both camps over there so that we had, you know, those traditions and those histories at the new place. You know, and it pretty much just took off from there. And I think Simple Lodge right now is about the only lodge left in the section that still has its same name and number. All
Really?
the rest of them through mergers and that have changed. Even Cuyahoga Lodge number 17 doesn't exist anymore. I don't know how that has happened. You know, we must be doing something right in this council that we can keep our, you know, our history when everybody else is giving it up. I haven't been active in the OA for about 15 years now, but they're having a conclave. They're hosting the conclave at Seven Ranges this weekend, actually.
Oh. Well, OA was very instrumental in the transition as well, in terms of because I remember when the trucks came in, because we got a lot of the reserve Army trucks coming in, but OA was there in full force and helping to load and unload those trucks throughout the course of that whole weekend.
Yeah, we were there for years before, you know, the 487 over there clearing campsites and building, you know, the roads and building some of the buildings that are there now. We built the parade grounds, the original parade grounds there at Seven Ranges. We really did a lot of the construction to, you know, to get that camp ready.
Yeah.
I want to say,
go ahead, Mark.
well, we started doing summer ordeals at Seven Ranges. Before it had just been the spring ordeal and the fall ordeal to set up and tear down camp.
Right.
But then we did the summer ordeal, 84 and 85. I don't remember if we started before that.
I'm going to say 85, Mark.
What's that?
I think it was 85. I'm trying to remember because I actually did my ordeal there.
Okay.
My troop never. They had Bob Brinlinger had some kind of a fallout with OA, and so we never had elections in our troop. And so my brothers were like the last ones to be at OA for a long time. And then, so the staff, the last year at Tuscazor, the staff voted me in. So I got my ordeal at Seven Ranges with that group, 85. Yeah, I think 85.
Yeah, I think we may have had one in 84 as well. We used Bouquet's View as the main area where we did everything, because there was no facilities, no dining hall at that point. We took the grills over from Tuscazor in the back of the camp truck, because I about lost them going around that curve coming in the back way. Never followed Keith Boyer trying to figure out where you're going with a truck full of grills. But that was an interesting thing, and you know that we did those ordeals. And then, as I think Jim said, the flagpoles were donated by Elmer Blau, and the original barnstone was all on property and then relocated to make the parade grounds below the original parade grounds below the road.
Mm-hmm.
And they got moved up.
That old barn sat there right below where the trading post is now, and we moved all those big barn stones down there from that to parade grounds. And we put a time capsule in when we did it. I have no idea. I wonder if anybody knows what happened to that time capsule.
Yeah, I do.
Oh, really?
Keith Boyer has it. I think it's in his garage. The powers that be at camp said, "Get it the hell out of here. We don't want it."
Really?
Yep.
There were actually 2 time capsules, because the 87 staff at Tuscazor, Rick Weber and I we were support services, which was pretty much anything that didn't have a home we were in charge of. But Rick had some brickwork experience, and we actually built 2 spiral pillars into camp and that's where the lanterns originally were supposed to go. And they were there we put a time capsule in one of those pillars that first year. And Mark, I'm not sure when it was, probably maybe 10 years down the road or so, that a Cisco truck or a food truck came around that corner a little too fast and took out one of the pillars, and the time capsule was opened or exposed. I think it's actually that's actually in the council office, or it was.
That's the last I knew when Dave Truex was there, that I don't think the capsule had been open, but it was in his office.
Right. We've been talking about bringing it back to Seven Ranges and then having Seven Ranges staff add to it and rebury it someplace. But I don't know if we'll ever get around to doing that. I know, Ted, have you heard any ideas, any thoughts about that?
No, I've been pretty much out of the loop. We moved to Springfield, Ohio in 2003. So I've been here since. I don't think I've been to camp. It was probably 2000, 2001, 2002, maybe.
Mhm.
So it's been a while for me. Last time I was at a camp would have been the last time we had a reunion. So at Tuscaloosa there. So yeah, I'm a little bit removed. Unfortunately, my son's just now getting to the scouting age, and I haven't convinced him. We got to find a troop and take him to a meeting here at some point soon to see if there's any spark of interest there. I keep trying to talk him into it. So
Yeah. Well, keep trying. They'll come
yep,
around.
absolutely. Yeah.
Well, Mark.
Well, we lost Ralph. Sort
Yeah.
of fading here, and my wife came home, so I'd like to at least say hello to her sometime tonight. But it's been a good conversation. Thank you for people putting things together, doing some research. Jim, I'll try to hunt you up this weekend at the fairgrounds. But thank you
Sounds
all for
good.
your time tonight and sharing.
Yeah.
It's fun how you hear somebody talk about something and these memories come back to things you hadn't thought of in years and years. And it's like, it just comes back like it was yesterday. So thank you for all for doing that and bringing back those memories for me.
Yep. And if you don't mind, I recorded this tonight, so we're going to make this available for people that couldn't be here. They can find it on the website and listen to it. So just a point, we're still planning for September 9th, 10th, and 11th for the reunion. So you'll be hearing stuff from us coming out. So Gene, look for, now that we have you registered, look for information.
Okay.
We'd love to have you there. It'd be great.
Yeah. I don't get around very well. So
I understand.
I have to go by golf cart.
Yeah, well, we do have a couple of those once you get there. We have 2 or 3 that we use to get people around, so that's not an issue.
Okay.
So, but if not, we'll
I just
arrange
want to say briefly, I know you all want to go, but I appreciate what you all have done. I kind of lost touch of it all. And I agree with Jim, some of the comments that he made earlier. I don't think if you all hadn't done that kind of transition, if Seven Ranges, I mean, I was involved in the buying and all of that. I wasn't personally involved, but I was there when all that started. I don't think that camp would be successful without the history that we had taken to it. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but
I think
if we were a brand new council and you were starting that camp, it wouldn't have near in the beginning what it had. From what I didn't realize, all the stuff you all had done, in the years after I left before the camp. I mean, the camp was established before I left because John Dodge was living there, and was their new caretaker and all that. And the only time I've ever been to the camp was when they had the first camp reunion long ago. I forget how many 100 years ago that was that I came there for that one. But, we all kind of joined up there. And that was my only time of actually seeing it as a camp. I mean, I'd been there before it was open, but,
you'd be impressed, Gene. It really grew into what we thought it was going to grow into.
Yeah, I know Fred's kind of kept me up to date on some things, over the years. So he and I still communicate. So
good. Well,
Gene, it's been great seeing you.
Yeah, definitely.
yeah, thanks. I'm sorry I missed the other one. I was a week behind, and when
That's
I went
okay.
to log on, I said, "Whoops, I don't think that's going to work." So,
No, you can.
so I made it a point to try to get on this one, and I hope I didn't ruffle any feathers. There's just a lot of history
No.
that we all been through, and I think it's better just to move on and remember the good parts of the past,
Well,
I didn't know. I mean, I knew your father personally, of course, but I didn't know he was. I guess maybe I did know then he was a graphic artist, but I didn't know all the history about him drawing all the different things and stuff. So I really appreciated that part.
Oh, good. Thanks, Gene. Appreciate
He and
it.
I butted heads a few times, but you know,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
that's okay. He was a good guy.
Yeah, he was, but he was able to admit when he was wrong.
Well, that's because, you know, not, maybe we need to carry it out in private, not public, but you know, he was passed a torch, and
Yeah. Yeah.
I happen to have 2 copies, by the way, of the old book of the, what is it, the Tales of the
Tales of the
Tuscaroras,
Tuscaroras.
and one of them is signed by Chief Deaver. So, and many other signatures in it, but they never were able to be verified whether they actually signed them or not. But it has a lot of old signatures in the back of, but I don't remember where I got the 2 copies, but I still have them. So someday I need to put them somewhere where they're in safekeeping. If you can tell me where that is, whether it's the museum, if it's the museum at Tuscaloosa or where it is, but I don't know how I acquired them. Somebody gave me a bunch of stuff once before when I was in the council, but I didn't realize until recently when I opened them up that they all are signed inside by
Wow.
numerous people. Now, whether it's somebody that actually just kept it and wrote those names in the back, you know, or whether they're some of them are truly the people's signature.
I've got some of Dad's old papers. I bet I could compare them because I know some of those signatures might be on other documents that I have.
Right. But I think there's something that, you know, I mean, I don't know if the museum is keeping all that stuff in contact or what we should do. You know, just like all the old patches and the things you've talked about. And fortunately or unfortunately, I'm a pack rat on certain things when it came to scouting. So I still have it all in one big trunk.
We'll talk to Kevin Powell. Kevin Powell is on the Tuscarora Foundation, and he's down there all the time. I'll ask him whether or not he thinks that's something that would go well in the museum there.
Well, eventually, you know, when I pass, somebody's just going to say, "What's all this crap?" You know, and so I don't want it to get tossed.
Right. Nope.
But it's like some of the mysteries of other stuff that have disappeared along the way, you know. So.
Yep.
I think we need only those of us that were involved in that part, you know, today they would be like, okay, who was he? It's like your comment there about Cecil, what was his name?
Cease Moorhead.
Yeah.
Moorhead.
I remember a couple of comments he made once, but I'm not going to repeat them on the air. So
It's okay.
Wisely.
Huh?
Very wise to not repeat some of those.
No,
Yeah.
I don't want to, but some, yeah, I was like, you got to be kidding me. He said that. So, but you know, those of us that were there, we'll never be able, we can talk about the history of it, but we lived the history.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so it's hard for new people to understand what we have been through. I don't mean that we've been through it, but we understand it better, you know,
Well,
especially the 2 camp thing, because like, you know,
Right.
my scout troop camped a lot at Tuscaloosa in the winter, but we always went to Buckeye in the summer.
Mhm.
So, you know,
I think you'd be pleased, Gene, because on the last two reunions we had a number of younger campers. Ted can attest to this from 7 Ranges, and there was a great deal of interest. You know, we had a lot of interest in their stories, and they had a lot of interest in the older stories as well. They were very. So I think one of the reasons for doing this is to really unify the staffs over the years, and I think it's really coming to fruition. People are.
well, and I think the point that Jim made, you know, I mean, we could go on here all night, but you know, we'll be the last 2 left. You know, the Pipestone program was entrenched at Tuscaloosa, you know,
Mhm.
and the OA was entrenched at Buckeye. So it gave them each, you know, something to hold on to, which is probably good when they merged, you know,
Yeah.
because one didn't have the other, and
Mhm.
they weren't about to give up their part to have the other part, you know.
Nope.
So it was good when they merged, and then they were able to keep those groups together, but it made us more a solid whole, you know, product in the end, because
Agreed.
you know, it just, we didn't have that history. You know, Fred and I have talked long about the long history of Tuscaloosa. And, you know, I never even knew there was a Troop 5 cabin or that we owned 500 acres, because you know, I was much more mobile back then, but I always thought it was just that little strip, you know, until I got more involved and realized we had hundreds of acres that we never used. You know?
Yep.
Well, we used it, but not.
Right.
I actually hiked the Pioneer Point once,
There you go.
long ago when I could still walk. So
Ah,
y'all
Well,
have a good evening. Thanks a lot.
thanks.
I really appreciated it.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Gene.
Gene.
Thanks. All right, guys. Mark, final words?
No, thank you all. And we'll do this again June 9th. If you've got some photos handy and you want to be able to share them on the screen share or hold them up, we're going to try and promote some of that. If you've got a couple photos and some good history or stories that you want to share with the group, that would be fine. So think through that and find a picture of OA Rock or whatever you might have in your archives there. So, all right. With that, thank you all.
Thanks, Jim. Kirk, thanks for your presentations. Mark, you want to hang around for 5
Right.
seconds? Ted,
Sure.
good seeing you again.
Seeing everybody. Thanks for all the, I love hearing more Buckeye stuff because that's kind of some of the stuff that I didn't.
I got mine in the basement.
That's it. Anyway.
I know what you're talking about. I can tell.
Well, that's interesting. I have to learn how to, you can't hold stuff up. So
Nope, there you
learn
go.
that too. So.
All right. I'm going to get
All
going.
right.
here.
Have a good night, Brian.
You too. Take care.
Thanks again.
Yep.